So in our last video, we talked about the two plans that were presented at the Constitutional Convention. So you had the Virginia plan, which you can think of as a large state plan, or the New Jersey plan, which you can think of as the small state plan. So a grand committee is going to have to meet to discuss these two plans and determine how states are going to be represented in the new government. And they are going to vote 5-4 on the Great Compromise, which you might also sometimes see as the Connecticut Compromise. They're interchangeable, means the same thing. And the Great Compromise is going to be the foundation for the government that we have now. So this is in the Constitution. It's going to set up a bicameral legislature. So it is going to create two chambers of Congress. You're going to have the House of Representatives, and then you're going to have the Senate. So members of the House of Representatives are going to be chosen according to state population and directly elected by the people. So today, the number of representatives that each state has is going to be determined by population. So that's the House of Representatives. In the Senate, each state has 2 senators, and they are chosen by state legislatures. So at this point, senators are not directly elected by the people. They're chosen by state legislatures. But every state has 2 senators. So this is going to be a compromise between those two plans. Remember, the Virginia plan is going to want representation based on population. The New Jersey plan wants every state to have an equal vote. So that is the compromise here, with the House of Representatives being chosen according to population, and then every state getting 2 senators. Now, this is a chart, if you want to go back and look at it, that really just compares the two plans. It's in the slideshow, so if you want to study this chart, go ahead. Now, there's also going to have to be a compromise over slavery. Okay, so slavery is going to be part of the Constitutional Convention. They are going to have to determine how slaves should factor into representation. So about 1/3 of the delegates at the convention are slave owners, and this is going to include James Madison and George Washington. And these southern plantation owners are not wanting to see slavery outlawed or heavily regulated. Slavery is a big part of their livelihood, their finances. So at this point, they do not want to see the national government regulating slavery. However, as we said before, aside from a few speeches, the subject of slavery wasn't really debated in terms of morality or liberty. So they weren't necessarily talking about whether or not slavery was right or wrong at this point. However, they're looking at slavery in terms of a state's representation. So how should slaves factor in to a state's representation? And they're going to come up with this 3/5 compromise. And in the compromise, it says a slave, also called an other person. Now, in the Constitution, it does not say slave. It says other person, would count as 3/5 of a person in calculating a state's representation in the House. So what this means is that when they are determining the number of representatives for each state in the House of Representatives, a slave is counted as 3/5 of a person. So at this point, slaves cannot vote, but they are going to influence or boost the influence of slave states. And that's because slave-holding states are going to be allotted more members of Congress as a result. So their population is going to be larger, which means they are going to get more representation in the House of Representatives. And this also means that they are going to have more members in the Electoral College, which means they have more say in electing president. Now, we'll talk about the Electoral College more in later units, but the number of electors that each state has is based on the number of representatives and senators that they have in Congress. So the more members of Congress you have, the more electors you're going to have. So that means that those states with larger populations are going to have more influence in selecting the president. Now, at the convention, they're also going to discuss whether or not the federal government should have any kind of power in terms of regulating slavery. And this is where they're going to come to another compromise, and that's the compromise on importation. And that says that Congress cannot restrict slavery until 1808. So for 20 years, Congress cannot make any rules restricting the slave trade. The delegation is going to agree to preserve slavery, because slave owners, so those slaveholding states, are going to threaten to leave the convention if it's not protected. Had they left, the articles, which contained no restrictions on slavery, would have remained law. So at this point, they're seeing the Constitution as a compromise. Okay, so it is still better than the articles were. However, the question of slavery is only going to be temporarily handled, because we know that not too much later, the Civil War is going to occur. So slavery was only temporarily handled at this point, and that is where we're going to stop.